probably turn our
Turn off my phone.
phones.
Welcome back, everyone. Just wanted to introduce our next panel, which is selecting and managing post-restructured boards. This is actually a real pertinent topic for me personally because I'm working on a case where the lenders have demanded an independent director, and the sponsor said, "Okay, do you have any ideas?" And the lender said, "No." So, finding those candidates is an important task. So moderating the panel will be Steve Seiden from Seiden, KRIEGER Associates, Executive Recruiters. He'll be joined by John Weber, Head of Portfolio at Blue Mountain Capital Management, Alan Carr, CEO of DRIVETRAIN, LLC, and Michael Leitner, Managing Director at BLACKROCK.
Thanks for attending, and thanks to the panel members. As was said, this is probably one of the more important topics in a bankruptcy situation: what happens when the company emerges from Chapter 11 and the governance involved in it, both the management of the company and the board of directors. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, even though you've heard from the podium, and just in a very brief few sentences, say the role that you play in the bankruptcy world. First, Michael.
Sure, thanks. Michael Leitner, I'm a managing director at BLACKROCK. I am one of the co-heads of our direct lending and special situations investment strategies. I was previously a managing partner at Tenenbaum Capital Partners, where I was on our voting committee. I ran our tech, media, telecom investing efforts. I was there for about 15 years until we recently sold our firm to BLACKROCK. And prior to that, I worked for about 15 years in investment banking and also in industry, but notably at Microsoft and 3 telecom companies that went through bankruptcies back in the 2001, 2, and 3 timeframe. So we're a very active investor in companies that are going through all forms of different types of special situations. We have distress for control strategies. We're typically focusing on middle market companies and play a very active role in restructuring businesses and reconsummating boards of directors, management teams, et cetera, within all of our various funds.
Alan?
Hi, my name is Alan Carr. I'm a co-founder and CEO of DRIVETRAIN, LLC. We're an independent fiduciary services business, which is about as generic a name as I could think of for our business. Primarily what we do is we provide representation of the investment community through roles that they often cannot take or choose not to take. Board seats, liquidating trustees, litigation trustees, and things of that sort. I personally serve, aside from running my business, I serve as a director on many companies that are going through or have gone through a bankruptcy as an independent director, often brought in on the eve of or leading up to a potential filing or hopefully effecting an out-of-court workout as an independent director when the sponsor or other parties may have conflicts or the board itself doesn't have experience with restructuring.
John?
Thanks. I'm John Weber, and I head portfolio company management at Blue Mountain Capital Management. My role and my team's role is to look after the care and feeding of companies where we are influential investors, and many of those companies are acquired through the debt. And so we look after post-reorg oversight and find that board composition and board management is a critical lever for value creation. I've been doing versions of what I do today for the last 17 years, starting with, I used to work for Carl Icahn, headed the similar group there, portfolio group, and I've worked with Goldman Sachs Special Situations Group, and prior to Blue Mountain at Anchorage. And over the course of that time, I've probably done at least 100 different board searches of companies in which we have been involved, and so bear both battle scars and have some pattern recognition dealing with this issue.
So going backwards, I'm going to ask each of the panelists the same question, which is, I'd like you to relate some specific experiences dealing with post-bankruptcy boards, including, and more importantly, what lessons have we learned and can impart to the audience. But before we start with John, I'd like to make this into sort of a dialogue between the audience and the panelists. So while we will have an opportunity at the end for Q&A, if you think that there's a question relevant to some comment that you've just heard, please chime in and we'll recognize you from the floor. But John, tell us about some current experiences and what lessons have you learned that the audience can take away?
I'd say the overarching lesson, and there may be people in this room that disagree with this perspective, but I mean, I find that too often for investors, the composition of the board and even the post-reorg management of the business is an afterthought. They're very focused on, the contest for control and the capital structure, and don't spend enough time thinking about post-reorg management, so much so that they even outsource this critical task of selecting the board to professional service providers without being directly involved. And for me, having seen this movie many times before, the board has a critical role in a post-reorg company because it's an entire reboot, and one can't assume that whatever the company was doing before, they ought to just keep doing. Usually there's management that has some version of PTSD. Usually there are changes that need to be made in the company. And so it's an intense, difficult job. And the typical, I'd say, director from central casting who kind of phones it in and shows up at the meetings and flips the board book and eats some cookies is very poorly cast for this role, which is a very heavy lift. And so we spend a lot of time with people alongside whom we invest, thinking about, kind of curating the composition of the board, developing a matrix, thinking about what the competencies that we need. And the last thing we want to do is together pick a board with the kind of the spoil system that often works in the distress community where, well, I'll get one, you get two, and we'll put our cronies on, and that usually doesn't end well for companies that have been troubled.
Any specific examples, both plus and minus, on what you've just commented on? Are there companies that you have seen that went the wrong way and didn't pay the kinds of attention to finding the directors or the management?
I think we'll kind of...
Or a positive situation that you've been involved in where the board made all the difference. And
these are all challenging situations, and I'm not, I'd rather not just kind of get into names. Thanks.
Alan, any lessons learned that the audience ought to...
Yeah. Again, I'm not going to name names, but people know some of the deals I've worked on. They can probably extrapolate what I'm talking about. There's a spectrum of experiences I've seen where you have what you describe as the everybody gets a seat kind of thing, and you get a very hedge fund focused, oftentimes people from the funds themselves or people like me filling all those seats, and you get a very heavy board that looks like a lot of clones of myself. Then you have the other side where you have these searches that go to just industry people. The happy medium to me is somewhere in between. Boards by design are collections of different thought processes, experience sets, and you want to have a diverse board in every way: gender, race, business experience, background, legal, finance, what have you, regulatory, other things like that. So you want a diverse, and that's what John does a lot of, is looking for that diversity of that board.
And I mean, take this as a compliment. They're not exactly clones of yourself, because though you are more an investor profile, I mean, you actually do this job well, and I don't mean to just flatter you as a friend, but a lot of times investors take these jobs at being on a board, and they're conflicted, they're involved at different levels of the cap stack, they phone it in, they literally phone it in. They're in front of Bloomberg terminals multitasking while they're on board meetings. They don't develop relationships with members of management. And so while it's true that you're not an industrial type board member, at least you spend a lot of time and are structured and disciplined about it, which, very often when firms put their own investors on, they're not.
Can I use that for my commercial?
Go for it.
But I think, and I appreciate that, but I think the point I want to make is that there's two dichotomies. I always joke that, the old retirement gift was a gold watch. Now it's board seats. You leave a company, maybe you're in the C-suite, didn't make a CEO, you get a couple, particularly public company boards. And they are the situation where people want to go to a steak dinner, talk about the old times, and sort of talk to their old friends and cronies. Boards that are full of just that, it's one collective thought in an industry. And people who are all from the investing world, it's one collective thought. You need a mix. In my view and my experience, that the right mix is probably somewhere in the 30% range of people who are more think like the investors, because you have often owners of these companies who didn't intend to own it often also, right? You have people who have what I call private equity the hard way. They buy the debt at a discount. They think it's going to pull to par, and guess what? It doesn't, and you own the thing. And they're oftentimes they're not ready for the discussion about that John mentioned earlier, that's why it's the last thing they think about, because it's not their first skill set. These guys think that way about it, so they're on the front foot of that. So you need to have this balance around that stuff, and I think when you have too much of a group thought on anything, you want to have boardrooms where people disagree, not to a point of violence, but to a point of collective thought in getting the better result out of it. And some of the best meetings I've been in a boardroom is where people come in with very divergent views and nobody gets what they want. Everybody, just like a bankruptcy, right? Everybody gets to a place that's the right answer because of it. And nothing's perfect, and in hindsight, no decision is perfect. But at least you're getting a thought that brings in different experience sets. So you don't want all industry people. And oftentimes when you go out and hire a professional headhunter, you're usually hiring them because you want industry experience. Great. But you also want to have that voice in the room which understands also the time perspective of the investor, who's not a natural investor, because let's face it, a lot of distressed investors in industries are tourists. We invest in distressed industries because of the opportunity set that's there. Most distressed guys were not investing in oil and gas 10 years ago. They are now. And at some point that cycle will return and recover, and they'll leave and do the next thing. It's happened with aircraft 10 years ago. So I think when you think about it, you want to have this mix of representation of the mindset of your stakeholders, whether it's an M&A transaction, a quick sale, change in management, whatever else. And you also want to have industry people. I learn a lot, and I love working with people who are hardworking, not there just for the steak dinners, industry people who want to learn from me, and I want to learn from them. So there's really and it seems like an obvious answer, but oftentimes because they're last minute, it's either just go hire a headhunter and get us all industry people, or the hell with that, we'll do it all ourselves. And neither of those things work out well in my experience.
Michael, how about some lessons learned for the
Sure.
audience?
So I would say, and maybe I'll just start with a little context. When our firm gets involved in a distressed situation, we're not looking at trading it. We're looking at owning the business, rehabilitating it, investing in it, owning it. So the single most important decision after we make the decision that we want to be an investor in a particular company based upon the circumstances that have brought us into it is who is going to govern that company for us and with us. And it's the board, and it's also management. And I think the biggest lesson that we have learned as an organization is make sure you diagnose why you are investing in this company and make sure you have the alignment with the types of directors that fit that diagnosis. So if we've invested in a company that is going through secular change, and that's why its capital structure went awry. A secular change is different than a cyclical change, and it could be a company that has to grow itself, that requires capital, or it could be in an industry that is going through some kinds of paradigm shifts. All those diagnoses as to why we're going into it drive the kind of directors that we need, and that is really critical. And it is the kind of thing that when we are going through the negotiation of what the post-reorg capital structure is going to look like, that's when the investors need to come together and really try as best they can to understand where is the common visions of where to take the company on a post-reorg basis. How long do we want to stay in the company? What kind of capital that we need to put into it? And what are the problems that we use our directors to solve? And at some level, when you think about how much money we spend on reorganization, the amount of money that we spend on directors is probably the best investment we'll make in terms of populating the best and brightest people to take our company to the next level. Because at some level, the returns that we will make is going to be governed about what we do with these assets on a post-reorg basis than whether we bought a debt claim in at 50 cents or 60 cents or 70 cents. It's really going to be what we do with it after. So the lessons for myself and through our organization is diagnose the problem as soon as you can. Try not to make so many director changes as you go through it. You'll have to make the decisions about, do I need a board that is going to be looking to replace our management team, or will we be replacing our management team at the outset? And from a personal standpoint, tend to favor industry directors as opposed to just purely great board athletes, because I think the industry needs are usually more prevalent to companies that are going through cyclical or secular changes, and that's really the help that we need to bring to the table. But it's really just diagnosing what it is that you need and really working as best you can out of the gate. You can really populate, with the folks that make the company work and improve the business.
Steve, can I pick up a point there? Because maybe we'll get to it later, but well, it's fresh in my mind. Also, particularly for investors who are making these decisions and having these discussions, and remember, it's a group think, right? You come into a deal and a restructuring, and you show up to the first creditor meeting, and you find out who your partners are. It's the most awkward type of club private equity deal out there. You didn't pick your dance partner. Your competitor is now your partner. And you all have different perspectives, different fund structures, time horizons, views on whether you want to control it or not, and it creates a lot of tension. And I think that's often why these things often happen at the last minute, because there's a lot of infighting that happens in tension around who's going to control and everything else. And that's not helpful. And when you become a director in those situations, I often ask the question when even being considered is, what's the dynamic like? Who's involved? Is there actually a clarity of thought within the group about what they want from this board? Because you will often get, 8 different messages from 6 different firms, about what they want done. That doesn't help the investor either, and all it does is make, particularly investors, directors who are industry people, in my experience, just throw their hands up and I don't know what the heck to do. It scares them because all I'm going to do is be blamed that I got it wrong with somebody. Right. Yep. And secondarily, they may just revert back to, I'll do what's best, which may be the right answer, by the way.
Right, and what makes that job even more difficult is that sometimes the reflex of people from the distress community is to be adversarial. And so their kind of default mode is to kind of get on the board and school management. You own the company at that point, you are the company. So there's really not a lot to be gained by treating management and treating the board as an adversary, or treating the company as an adversary. You kind of got to get on sides with them and look for a certain personality profile that will do that. And by that, I don't mean somebody that's kind of go native and suck up to management. That's the last thing that you want. But at least you want a board that will build trust, build a relationship, be there for the long term. And for me, process-wise, just to pick up on Alan's comment, I mean, I just believe form a committee of lenders, of creditors, and get in a room and sort it out together rather than just the spoils system. And once, as a group, you start meeting a handful of candidates together, and you force yourself to have criteria and say, well, this is what good looks like, and this is the kind of skill set that we're looking for. We need somebody that can grow top line. We need somebody who can cut costs. We need somebody who knows international. We need somebody who can chair the audit committee. Then, you work together and hopefully build some trust among a creditor group as you go through that process. And it can be done fairly quickly. I mean, 3 to 4 weeks if you think ahead a little bit.
So John, just to amplify on the point you made, aside from industry experience and whether you need to populate the audit committee, the comp and benefits, etc., what are the human qualities that a director ought to possess, particularly in a post-11 situation, which can be more adversarial?
Yeah, I'd say the number one characteristic is willingness to commit time. And sometimes folks use overboarding as a proxy for that because they assume that a person who sits on 5 or 6 boards at the same time won't find time to do this well, which at times can be true. But I've noticed over time that those who can dedicate the time, and I just use this as a proxy, like somebody who's willing to spend 15 to 20% of their professional time on this situation during the year post-emergence, that's what's necessary to go visit facilities, to form relationships, to learn the business, to go to conferences, to spend windshield time with members of management. And if someone's not willing to or interested in doing that, they're probably not right for this board. Secondly, we look for someone that, I spoke earlier about building rapport with management, but the last thing that we need is a board that's led around by management. So it's got to be a person with governance experience that knows enough to know the role, that has a board with strong leadership, that's going to serve as an effective check on management dominating the board. Because we've all seen that movie before, that a lazy board gets led around on a leash by management, and that's a recipe for disaster in these types of situations. So we look for a person with some industry credibility, street cred that management may actually view positively as adding value to the company, somebody who's really willing to sweat the details, somebody who's familiar with their way around the boardroom and not going to get pushed around.
Can I pick up on that? Because you took one end of the spectrum, right? A board that can get led around by management. You also have scenarios where, I mentioned earlier, you may have people who come out of a C-suite of a public company or private company, never got that chance to be the CEO. They still have a score to settle, so to speak, professionally. And you oftentimes, in moving from management to a director is very different. It's subtle, but it's very different. You are not management. Now, oftentimes you will, I'm sure you will talk about this, always have a contingency plan that maybe you have one director with your eye as the backup plan. They may be the contingency plan that CEO doesn't work out, step on an interim basis at least to catch it if you have to. Because oftentimes these management teams are fatigued when it's over. They have nice incentive plans when they exit. They might just say, check please, and they'll move on, and you can really be caught flat-footed. And you often have to react to that. But how do you deal with the other side of what you're saying about not being led on by management, but also having people who really are actually gunning for the CEO's job? Because I see that from time to time where they haven't really made a transition out of being management. They want to be on the board, but they also really effectively are trying to run the company in undercut.
And I was just going to add to that, in the context where we're dealing with private companies as opposed to public companies, the lines can be and sometimes should be a little grayer between what's the role of the board and what's the role of management to be refereed at some level by the investors. And I tend to think that the role of the board in the private company that has just gone through a capital structure reorganization is to manage the management team. And sometimes it's good to have ex-CEOs come back. Sometimes it's great to have ex-CMOs and ex-CFOs and all the various functions so they can add and probe and be invasive and challenge, because we want to have that as investors, because it's so often the case that I'd like to think that we are not like this, but it is often the case when you get this consortium of 3 or 4 investors, not everybody really understands what it is that they bought into. And it's really only through that board dynamic do you get that education process. But the goal of the board isn't to manage the board as if it were a public company where the lines of director and the lines of management are, just unambiguous and clear. I like to use the board a little bit more invasively, and it does change. It's a very different type of individual that we look at recruiting versus if it were a public company situation, which we have a number of those situations as well.
Right. I actually think that's a really salient distinction for post-distress companies. When you interview board members, they'll often spout phrases like, noses in, fingers out. They have in their mind some very strict delineation of what the board is supposed to do. And that's usually wrong in a troubled company, in a post-reorg company. You just need to be more hands-on, even in a public company context. And I don't mean actually acting like management, but I do mean being involved in the business and influential in a way that would be uncharacteristic of most board members. So just back to the point of, how do you avoid the situation of a frustrated CEO who wants the CEO's job? That usually doesn't work out well for me on boards, because if I don't end up giving that job to the person who wants to be the CEO, he or she will take a job on another board, and then I'm going to end up rotating. So I kind of screen for folks that have decided that they're not looking for a full-time day job. Now, on occasion, and Michael and I have shared experience, you'll have a situation where you need to make a change and the person's willing to step in. But it is not a great idea for me to interview people for a board role who are concurrently looking for a full-time day job. That just doesn't end well. They'll end up not being on that board for very long, or when they get a full-time day job, the board role will become a distant stepchild. They'll not show to meetings. They won't do a good job. So I kind of tend to avoid those people.
I'm going to kind of weigh in here. I think a litmus test to find out what is the director that you're about, what is the candidate rather that you're about to make a director, how does he or she comport themselves in a boardroom? And I think one of the most effective things that we've been able to do as search consultants is go and meet with people face to face who have served on a board or in some other group capacity to find out, is this individual the kind of an individual that will work best for this board? Is it a go-along-to-get-along person? Is it somebody that's too strident? But a face-to-face interview with somebody who's been in a boardroom with the potential candidate, I think, is an indispensable tool. I don't know if any of you have done that or not.
Look, we do off-list referencing uniformly and exhaustively for everybody that we put on these boards. We hire a third-party research firm who contacts others and finds out what they're like to work with, people who have worked for them, for whom they've worked and who've worked alongside them in a board. I will say, though, that on balance, the risk of somebody who's imperious and invasive is much less than the risk of somebody who's passive and odorless and colorless and does nothing. That's much more the style of people who sit on boards. And the best interview test for that is you just ask them, give me an example where you've disagreed, where you've had a heated disagreement with somebody in the last 5 years that you've been on this board. And I'll tell you, like, 2/3 of the people will say, well, you know, we're real collegial. We all get along. And, like, to me, that's a flag that, you know, they're just passive and going with the flow and haven't really made a difference. And most board candidates who are that way will reveal themselves just by simply asking that question.
I made the comment earlier that one of the important jobs as the investor director is to referee board conflicts every once in a while. And sometimes it happens more than every once in a while, but you'll never know through an interview process exactly what is the social fabric of the board. And boards have to work, they have to work as a collective, they have to be well organized, people have to be able to exchange ideas, some of which may be controversial without a recipient overreacting, and it doesn't always work out that way because we're all human and we all have our reactions. And having investors on the board to referee those dynamics are very important because there are always politics that will pop up, sometimes between investors, but sometimes it's between the industry board members and the management team. And sometimes it's helpful because it may highlight to us that we don't have the right management team, or maybe we don't have the right director. But the management teams usually need to have people to go to, which could be an executive chair, or it also could be the investor directors. So we're always going to try to make fewer mistakes on the bona fides of somebody's skill sets to contribute to the corporate governance process, but we'll never know the social fabric until, you know, we go through a number of meetings, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, look, and I have that. I've seen. I think at this point I've seen every type of director there is in the sense of personality and style, and sometimes it's the dynamic of the boardroom itself, but mostly it's just the dynamic, the DNA, and the experience of that director. Many people have not had to deal with difficult. They've been at growth companies their whole life and career, and they retired, you know, at 65 with a full package, and you know, God bless them. And they haven't dealt with adversity or difficult situations, or they got to where they did in a big public company because they played a political game really well. So everybody liked you. You did well, right? The people who survive these things are very political. Most people from distress, we all came up sort of rough and tumble. And so, and you're in a distress scenario, you really are blocking and tackling in formality, and protocol matters, but it's not about, you know, we'll talk to you, you know, I got involved in a board recently, and they were treating it was a private company, treating it like a public company. And I'm like, why is this board so big? Why do we have all these formal committees? Why are we waiting for updates every quarter? I'm like, I want to know every 2 weeks what's going on. I want to know, you know, we need monthly board calls, and we need, and it was like, but we're getting ready to go public. I'm like, trust me, if I'm on your board, you're not going public anytime soon. So, you know, it's a troubled situation. I said, we got to stop that and treat this like, interestingly, the general counsel and the CEO had a sigh of relief. Like, thank you. We would have more help, but the board that was there was all from big, healthy public company directors who just knew that way of doing things. And you can't wish what you are. You are what you are, and you have to do it that way.
But I'll say this. Well, first, you're absolutely right about how people who get ahead in corporate America are, you know, social political animals. My former boss, Carl used to say it's reverse Darwinianism, that you get ahead by being the president of your fraternity and being somebody that everybody likes. And I think there's absolutely an element of truth to that. And I'll even go further to say that in many of the situations I've been involved in, the CEO is not championing an influential board. They're championing the opposite. They like to have like a large board that's kind of like somebody who fancies themselves as keeping control would like to have a large board, because the larger the board, the harder it is to organize, the less influential they'll be. They like to sprinkle it with a few, you know, celebrity board members, people who are famous, maybe an academic here or there.
Football player.
You know, football player, always the place of the football player. And then that board will just end up being led around on a leash. And CEOs are good at that, and they're good at like picking off people and forming relationships and, you know, giving them a ride on the corporate plane if you've somehow mistakenly allowed there to be a corporate plane by the end of restructuring. And you've got to take away the ability to have those perks. And one live situation or actual situation I'll mention is that when I was at Anchorage, we did the board of MGM Studios, and we were really careful not to put anybody on the board from Los Angeles. Because if you were in the orbit of somebody that ran a movie studio in Los Angeles, they were going to be seduced by management, and you needed to make sure that they didn't fall into that orbit.
So when you're populating the committees of the board in a post-bankruptcy situation, which are the most important, and how do you find out whether or not someone's capable of being, obviously audit committee has certain qualifications that you need, but the other committees, which are the more important ones, and how do you populate them?
I can start. The compensation committee, always, in my view, the most important, because when you're defining and deciding the compensation for your management team, obviously there's nothing more important for that group of people, but it's where you are aligning incentives throughout the organization, deciding how deep you want to drive various forms of compensation, whether it's going to be equity incentive plans, whatever tools one wants to use. But that is that's very critical. Using that committee to also align the board to shareholders and the board to management, so that everybody's thinking about the business and value creation in the same way. Very, very critical. I tend to like comp committees that either have had ex-chairman of the board. I like investors sitting on the comp committee as well, because at some level that is the balancing act of just making sure that management, directors, shareholders, again, all have that alignment as to how we're all defining value creation. And then it also is this helpful tool for investors, because it's only when we start defining comp plans do we actually start thinking about how long do we want to be in this business, what is a successful exit, when should such an exit take place. And it's really one of the early tools when we take a business over on a post-reorg basis. Do we really kind of have that that moment of trying to align some of our thinking about what our financial objectives are?
I couldn't agree more. I think compensation committee chair is the hardest job in a boardroom. Audit committee is important. You have to have certain qualifications, but it's a checklist. You walk through and it's very precise, and you know the right answer. You got audit right or you didn't, right? Comp, no one's ever happy with you. You can't make anybody happy, because your investors are upset because you overpaid your team, or your team's upset because they've been underpaid. And I do think you need an industry person, because there is an absolute conflict between management who's giving you a budget and a plan where they're incentivized, at least from that perspective, to sandbag numbers. Let's just call it what it is. And you have to have an industry person available to say, the way they're doing this, they're pulling EBITDA in faster, whatever metric you give them, they're going to manipulate that as best. It's just human nature. And you are driving behavior in a very direct way. So you send them a message, which you may not even understand what message you're sending them at times about what you're doing. So you need to also have the investor voice who says, the overlying view is, this is our exit strategy, and here's how we're going to incentivize that. And we're going to incentivize certain metrics because it's going to help us refinance the company or get out, whatever it could be. But that tension is, by definition, the most thankless job in the boardroom.
It is amazing that if you look at the NACD data or other data on board comp, the audit committee chair gets paid significantly more than the comp committee chair. And that's a mistake for the reasons that you've just heard. And so we pay the audit committee and comp committee chairs the same. And we pay them a lot. And there needs to be a significant premium, because being the chairman of those committees takes a lot of time. And just in keeping with my desire to keep boards small, like ideally to 7 members, not 9 or 11, I try to keep the number of committees small, because otherwise the math doesn't work. So just try to kind of keep it down to, combine comp and nom and governance, combine audit with compliance or risk. So you just got 2 committees. And those end up being, very influential focal points to drive change, and importantly, in which management does not have a seat.
Which, by the way, I think also weeds out the people who have the time commitment, because that's a lot of time. Because you end up sitting on a 7-person board. The CEO's got a spot usually. So you think about those committees are 2 to 3 people max. That means you're sitting on 2 committees almost always if you're not management. So you have the board commitments plus those committees. Nom-gov is a little more idiosyncratic. It's got an annual cycle, and it may not be as unless you've got something interesting going on, it's not as tricky. But comp is coming up constantly. C-suite changes, annual budgets, and everybody's always carping and complaining, and everybody's also has their hand out because they just got through it and they just lost all their equity, right? So you really, that does weed out the availability of time because it really can suck you in.
Yeah, I'll just add one last point. When you, right after a reorganization, the audit committee plays a important role, and it's we typically expand audit to include risk and all forms of enterprise risks, and because I personally, and our firm probably skews a little bit more toward tech and some media businesses, telecommunications businesses, business services, things like information technology and data are really critical assets. And a number of companies that have financial issues, that are going through some kind of reorg, that don't have cybersecurity audits or don't have really good information, firewall protection, don't really have a good handle on really where their core enterprise risks are it's incredible. And that is something that when we get in, and when you're a creditor and you're sitting as an outsider, until the company closes its reorg, you are the new owners, you've got your people on the board, you're really not aware of all the attendant risks that you might face. So I think that audit committee is really important for the first year, 18 months. It's got to have an expanded charter, and it really has to probe not just the basics of what an audit committee charter might say, but really expand into all forms of enterprise risk assessment.
Let's talk about the lead director or chair. When does he or she get chosen, and what are, in your judgment, what are the standards?
Yeah, well, first I would say at least a 50% premium, probably 100% premium in terms of time, dedication, and money that you pay that person. Because a board without a leader doesn't really function properly. So I expect that the lead director, sometimes it's the chairman of the comp committee, is going to effectively be overseeing the CEO and having weekly calls post-reorg and having very substantial interaction with management. So that person should not be left for the board to pick itself. I mean, we will typically, in a selection process, determine, even though technically that person is selected by the board, we will preordain who we want as an investor group to serve in that capacity. And they've got to have time. By the way, don't really see, the only reason I would appoint a lead director as opposed to a chairperson is because the CEO has it in his or her contract that they're the chair. And I would try, if I didn't get rid of that contract in the restructuring, that CEO is not going to be the chairman, ideally, and you'll have a board chair and not a lead director.
Alan, how do you find a good lead director or chair?
Frankly, as John said, I'm often coming in the situation where that's mandated. I think it's actually better in some respects to come from the owners because it sends a message. And I think the one thing is that, particularly if the board is coming together, I think the investors, if they can, consulting with the other directors, because sometimes there are, backroom or, boardroom noise and politics that people don't understand in that dynamic. You don't want, you set the tone from the top, and you want a benevolent dictator as your lead director or chairman, but you want somebody who's going to actually respect it. And, I think that's the exception to the rule, by the way. I think most lead directors are excellent. I just think you want to have that dynamic. But I do think, frankly, the investors making that decision, I think it sends a message to the board of what their singular or primary focus is.
Most important position that the investor group ever chooses, and I agree. It should be it's an investor-led decision. I can't think of the, since over the last decade plus, any scenario where, and this is to John's point, where we would ever allow the CEO to retain a chair role, because the whole critical point of taking over this business is if the pre-existing CEO is rolling over into the new company, which happens, we're not certain that that's the best long-term CEO, because obviously there's a reason as to why we got into a situation in the first place. So that chairman or executive chairman, as the case may be, really is critical. For the best formulas for success I've seen is an industry person that's been through cycles. If the company is needs to grow its way out of its own problems, that focuses on somebody that's really effective in sales and marketing and has been there and done it. If the company is a cost-cutting exercise in a secularly declining business, that there's really no way out, that leads just to a different operational skewed chairman. There are factors that, it's got to be a leader, it's got to be a great listener. The relationship between the CEO and that chairman has got to have buy-in. So even though the investors may want someone, not that a CEO would ever have veto, but that relationship's important to get going on day one. And quite often too, and John and I have been through a situation where I think we rotated about 4 or 5 chairmen into the role of CEO. So we also like to have chairmen that can step into that role of CEO.
That was my next question.
If we need it. That's a real important criteria because we never know.
By the way, like the explanation that the CEO will give you for why he needs to be chairman and why that's good for the business, those explanations are right up there with why they should keep the corporate aircraft as being like ridiculous and absurd explanations. But I've heard them many times. So it's good for the business, and if I take away the chairman title, they won't feel that I'm really in control. They'll feel like the company's being run by hedge funds. All nonsense. Just like the reasons for keeping the corporate jet.
I've had an experience where the investors put in a new board and put in a chairman, and within the boardroom there was a coup without input of any investors at all. And I refused to be part of it. And it was literally because somebody else wanted to be the chairperson, and it started infighting on the board. And in protest, I left the board over because my view was you have ignored the wish of your investors. And there was nothing procedure. Remember one important thing when you do these often. Now, a private deal may be different, but a lot of these deals, once you put the board in place, under the rules, absent an active proxy contest, you can't fix things that are done within that. So it's a group that you have to trust who can actually go rogue on the investors' own desires here. And that happened in this situation. And what I said to the people when I left, I said, you have just spit in the face of people who put you here. You've decided that you know better than them. And if you really had these views, what you should have done, you should have asked some of those key investors to become private. It wouldn't have been very restricting for a short period of time to have a conversation. And instead they went and did that, and I was like, I don't want to be part of that, because that was my view, was that you've basically done a disservice, and you've shot the middle finger to the people who put you there, and I was out.
I think we have time for a few questions, do we not? A couple of questions from the floor. Yes.
There seems to be a growing thought in the U.S. that the role of the board, the responsibility of the board should be to employees, suppliers, in addition to investors, owners. Do you think that's appropriate in a distress situation, if at all?
I'll just put this out there. I think this whole business roundtable thing is like a lot of rhetoric to avoid the wrath of Elizabeth Warren. I can't believe that any investor would responsibly say that they'd rather have board members who are looking out for somebody else's interest rather than their own. Now, in most cases, we figure out a way that community, employee, and customer interests are actually coincident with the interests of shareholders, so we find our way around that. But I think that's nonsense, and I do think it's nonsense that we ought to evolve towards a stakeholder corporate democracy is just bad for investors. I can't see why any investor would advocate that as being in an investor's best interest.
Considering my boss, ultimately Larry Fink, is one of the authors of that, it must be a great idea. No, but there is, there's absolutely a place for it. There's no question. In a distress context, it's a little bit different. There's obviously reasons why the company is distressed, and it's different sets of decisions. It's when companies are growing and generating lots of cash flow and have the ability to reallocate some element of its capital and profits to other stakeholders, that may be the right decision. When you are losing cash flow and struggling with sometimes to make payroll or different liquidity, it's a different set of decisions where the directors, at the end of the day, they have got a duty to the business and the enterprise, and that may not necessarily dictate one stakeholder over another, but they've got to make the decisions to keep the business afloat, alive, and doing the best they can. So there may be just different circumstances in the distress context than the typical corporate dynamic.
And I'll say, you know, in boardrooms, we see the results of not being environmentally conscious, employee conscious, like morale issues, right? Those things actually matter to the bottom line, actually. So there's an element of where's the push and the pull, and where does that come from? So I think there is an actual correlation in some businesses, particularly, to, you know, consumer products, right? Having environmentally friendly lines, right, can actually be, to John's point, it can actually be a business benefit as well, because there is a market there, and you want to pull that in. Everyone's trying to create the next, environmentally friendly whatever, right? And so, because there's a business there, because the market has demanded that. But to sort of be the arbiter of what is right for the world, right? I think that's not the first priority of a company that's bleeding cash.
A little thought experiment to see if you're really intellectually honest about this. And by the way, I'm not adverse at all to being socially conscious or a good corporate citizen. I think it's critically important for society as well as for investors. But if you're imagining you're interviewing a board candidate, and two board candidates are otherwise the same, and one of them you have complete confidence that they're on your team and always going to advocate for your interest, and the other one you think is really potentially going to tilt for interests that are not aligned with shareholder interests, you know, who do you think you're exercising your fiduciary duty by appointing? Do you think you're serving your investors, those pension funds or those sovereign wealth funds? Do you think you're serving their best interest by appointing somebody who's going to tilt against their interests? I find that very hard to reconcile.
That's a good note to leave it on. I want to thank all the panelists. We enjoyed your participation, and we'll be on to the next panel. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, man.
You can take this on the road if you like.